Last time we left off in chapter 4 with the calming of the sea in the storm. That was probably our most explicit or on the nose divine warrior activity by Jesus, where this is Jesus doing signature acts of the warrior God King of old. That's going to segue nicely into chapter 5 with Jesus and the Gerasene demoniac legion. It's a well-known story. The fact that it happens right on the heels of the calming of the storm, and there will actually even be some verbal tiebacks to the end of chapter 4 at the end of this episode. And so I think the two really need to be understood together. And since this is so dense, we're probably not going to go past this episode today. Now, the first thing we will note straight away here is the fact that this little section here is pretty neatly chiastic. And so as I write down here about this, the narrative is framed with a striking thematic symmetry. At the beginning, due to the demonic possession, the wild man is crying out day and night. By the end, the now restored man is proclaiming, and one might even say crying out, a new message about all the Lord has done for him. In the B and B prime sections, we move from the demon-possessed man's use of a distancing idiom. What do we have in common? A rhetorical question meant to emphasize social and spiritual separation from Jesus, to the healed man's plea to remain with him. So initially he wants to distance himself from Jesus, and at the end of the episode he's begging to go along with him. And in CNC Prime, Legion begs not to be sent out of the territory, a plea that finds its mirror in verse 17, where the people beg Jesus to leave the region. So we see some nice symmetry there. The demons beg not to be sent out of the region, then the people beg Jesus to leave the region himself. And of course, in this we have the large herd of swine in D prime, again, the herd. And then E and E prime, we have the entering of the swine by these unclean spirits. And then in the center, it's Jesus giving them permission to enter the swine. Now, by way of overview, let's look at Edwards here. He says, Jesus has just calmed a violent storm at sea. He now meets a man with an equally violent storm inside of him. In both cases, the power of Jesus prevails over chaos and destruction. Further down, he writes, once again, Jesus is connoted with God, for the Lord who has healed the demoniac is none other than Jesus. And we'll hit that point further down below. But Edwards concludes of the narrative, most people, if they were asked, would probably say that they would like to see a manifestation of God. But this story is a cold shower for such religious pipe dreams. When God manifests himself in Jesus, most people ask him to leave. Finally, there is a clear parallel in the outcome of both stories. The composure of the healed demoniac, dressed and in his right mind, is a counterpart to the great calm on the lake after the storm. Both outer and inner storms have been quelled by the authority of Jesus. Like the Spirit wresting order from depths and darkness in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, Jesus brings creation out of chaos. Now, as I write, note in Genesis 1, 2, that darkness is over the face of the deep, which is the Hebrew term tehom, one of our terms used for the chaotic waters in divine warrior texts. Now, Dempsey himself is going to, again, draw on this particular episode and its connections with divine warrior activity. He writes, Mark here portrays the Gerasene demoniac as the raging sea, which the divine warrior Jesus must subdue. So the enemy likewise rages, shouting day and night upon the mountains. The demoniac is in a perpetual state of disruption, and, like the demoniac in Mark 1, roars in irresistible might. Here, moreover, the demoniac is explicitly encountered in close proximity to the sea itself, heightening the connection with chaos and the traditional unruly waters. Likewise, the demoniac's residence among the tombs, apart from highlighting his uncleanness, may also parallel the chaos enemy's associations with the pit, as the term in Hebrew usage was equated with death and Sheol, and incidentally, the miry waters of death. The demoniac's habitation in tombs metaphorically links him with the realm of death. In this way, Mark has taken a symbolic mythic motif and converted it into a historical one, making the cosmic pit the earthly tombs. Finally, about the binding with chains, Mark uses the typical word, deo, again, the verb often used for the binding of chaos enemies. And so the fact that we have this demon-possessed man right next to the sea, right after the sea episode, again, the sea was symbolic of chaos, and we're going to get a very real interaction here with demons. It's not just symbolic, that they're actually going to have this confrontation. And here I'm going to cite Ricky Watt's book, Isaiah's New Exodus and Mark. And I really should have been citing this book more because he's actually hitting on a lot of the same themes that we've been hitting on so far with Jesus as the divine warrior. Here he's using the language of Isaianic Yahweh warrior, and he's tracking on the new Exodus motif. Now, we saw this in the introduction, Mark 1:1 through verse 3, that Mark is really tracking on a bunch of Old Testament verses and citations that are specifically, uniquely looking at Yahweh as the warrior king of old, the warrior God, the one that delivered the people out of the Exodus. And this is what they celebrate at Tabernacles. This is what they look forward to, a new future, new Exodus. And this is really what Watts is tracking on. Now, he's going to ask the question, if Mark is doing that, if Mark is tracking on Isaiah's new Exodus and saying Jesus is the fulfillment of that, Jesus is the warrior on the scene now, then where do we find the counterparts to those ideas in the new Exodus motif, so-called second Isaiah, as scholars sometimes refer to it, which is Isaiah 40 and following. But Watts writes, if Mark presents Jesus as the Isaianic Yahweh warrior, in other words, the divine warrior, what, if any, is the connection between Isaiah's picture of Israel's bondage to the nations and, more importantly, to the idols who epitomize those nations' power and wealth, and for want of a better term, demon possession in Mark? So in other words, what's the connection between demon possession and Israel's bondage to the nations, symbolized, epitomized by the idols? One link I suggest, he continues, lies in the growing association in the intertestamental period of demons with idols, where the former, that is demons, are progressively understood as the reality behind the latter, which is idols, right? So in other words, you have the idols, which themselves are nothing, right? They're wood, stone, gold, whatever. But behind them is a power, an entity, a reality, some personality. And what is it? Demons. You get that connection. Deuteronomy 32:17 makes that connection. And what he's pointing out, though, is in the intertestamental period, the Greek translations, for instance, also will at times change some of the wording. So you had in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, it says, the gods of the nations are idols. Well, when they translate that, in one particular instance, they say the gods of the nations are demons, right? So it makes that connection, which Paul makes in the New Testament, saying that he doesn't want the people to be in communion with demons. So he's saying an idol is nothing, but behind that idol is a power, a demon. And so that's the connection between the new Exodus motif. They were themselves bondage to the idols and to the powers of the nations, but that, again, behind that power is a higher demonic power that the people are now enslaved to. And so this is what Jesus arrives on the scene too. Now let me go ahead and actually just read out this introductory section just so we can have it all in our mind, and then we'll take it apart piece by piece. So starting at verse 1, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. And no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. That's going to continue, but we'll go ahead and break off there. But the first thing to note is gerasenes, this region. The commentaries actually spend a lot of time on this because it's one of those things, it's really impossible to know what's exactly going on. In fact, I pulled up here the map. So if I were to zoom out, notice here that they have Jesus traveling here to Gergesa. Now, of course, we have gerasenes over here. Now, if I were to zoom out, this is the Sea of Galilee, of course, Gadara, and then we have the gerasenes right here. So this is the region it speaks of in Mark. But part of the problem is, as you can see, this is way over here. And so there are those that want to say that this is probably more likely what was intended. But I do want to share with you one trajectory I thought was interesting. So this is Edwards. He says, "We cannot say for certain, but a town named Gergesa apparently existed in the northeast shore of the lake." And of course, that's what the Faith of Life shows. It's a short little trip down there, so it kind of makes sense. Both Origen and Eusebius identified the swine miracle with a town named Gergesa on the eastern side of the lake. Moreover, a midrash to Song of Songs mentions a form of the name in the following reference: "The graves of Gog and Magog will be open from south of the Kidron Valley to Gergesa on the eastern side of Lake Tiberias." Although the Zuta Midrash is late, this particular saying is ascribed to Rabbi Nehemiah, an acclaimed disciple of Akiba in the 2nd century AD. So that's kind of interesting because there we have graves, and then of course Gog and Magog, very eschatological. And they say the eastern side of Tiberias. If I were to zoom in, I'm not sure if it would show, but Tiberias is going to be like in this region over here. So who knows, maybe, but I thought that literary reference was kind of interesting. Now, as far as the tombs go, Watts writes of this that some of these details, like the stressing on the tomb dwelling, the presence of swine, they're kind of odd. So he says, unusually enough, motifs on their own right, this striking conjunction of the two has led commentators to posit Isaiah 65, 1-7, as the background to Mark's story, especially given the presence of demons in the Greek's version. And then he also has the Greek of Psalm 67, which we'll also look at. But we have here the people burning incense to demons, which it says that do not exist, which is kind of interesting. Now, this isn't in the Hebrew at all, this reference. But we have this reference here to demons. And then in verse 4, "Among their graves in the caves, they who eat swine meat and the broth of sacrifices lay down to sleep for the sake of the dreams. All their vessels are defiled," so on and so forth. But the fact that we have demons, we have graves, we have swine meat, so there are those that go in that direction. France here says the presence of such a person in the tombs, or however that's going to be translated, a place of uncleanness, has an obvious symbolic appropriateness, though it may also be noted that few more suitable places of shelter would be available to one ostracized from normal society than rock-cut tombs or burial caves. By the way, I want to say that there's some archaeological work that was done that they did find some what appeared to be tombs cut into like caves in that region over there, the Gergesa region. So that might also be another piece of evidence. But anyway, continuing, as I write, Mark is probably also drawing on Psalm 68:6 or 67:7 in the Greek. So that text states, "God causes the solitary to dwell in a house, leading those who have been bound fast in strength, likewise those who provoke, those who are dwelling in graves." And so this is going to get us into kind of a bit of a sidebar issue. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go all the way into this. Now, this is in the notes, so if you want to read all of this, I would encourage you to do so. So I'm actually going to mostly just kind of summarize this as best I can. So here's the issue. You kind of get almost two different feelings from the Hebrew and then versus the Greek. So in the Hebrew of Psalm 68, very divine warrior stuff, and you're going to have what appears to be conquest in its Old Testament context. And that's actually further down. I'm going to hit Heiser, Unseen Realm. He talks about this. This is in the region of Bashan in Psalm 68. It's basically the conquest of Bashan. And so it's conquest, right? But the Greek of this passage, it really seems to kind of flip it on its head a little bit. And so this is actually what Dempsey's talking about. So he's saying that this language could be translated into, into, or even with. That is, thus, the bound, the people bound, may be led into strength, that is, into prosperity, or led in strength as in triumph. So he's saying it could go either way in how you think of this. Are they being led into prosperity, or is the in strength a reference to the warrior having defeated his enemies, right? And that's what it's getting at. The wording of the Greek facilitates an interpretation which assimilates the leading of the bound in verse 7 with the image of the triumphal procession of captives that follows in verse 18, verse 19 in the Septuagint. In this reading, while led in submission to the gloating power of the divine warrior, the rebels themselves are ultimately redeemed and settled, even those who once dwelled in tombs. The sense the verse acquires in the later Greek interpretation has Yahweh leading his New Year procession of captives, but ultimately in order to redeem them. Perhaps I can kind of just summarize this because it gets a little bit into the weeds. So it's really getting into the question of how God's power operates in these battles. Is it primarily about conquest, leading the captive enemies? Think Ephesians 4, the use of the Hebrew Old Testament of Psalm 68. Or is it more about liberating the oppressed? So the Greek version, Psalm 67, in verse 7, speaking about leading the bound in or to strength. And so it's about liberation and restoration. But I don't think that these two concepts and symbols are necessarily in conflict with each other, because first has to conquer and expel the hostile. So there we have conquest. Legion has to be defeated. And that's more the idea you get in Ephesians 4, Psalm 68 in Hebrew. But after the conquest, he liberates the captive man. Jesus first binds the strong man. And remember, it says in the narrative, nobody was strong enough to do this, to bind this guy. But he now leads out the man who himself was once bound and living amongst tombs. So Jesus brings him out of this place of death. He's brought back to life. He's led to strength. So the man's life becomes kind of like the embodiment of this process, the battleground of his mind and soul. Again, this is what gospel means. It's a battle report. And so necessarily in battle, there is an enemy that gets defeated, that gets subdued. Like we have the context, even just in war and even in modern war. If a place is enemy occupied territory and it's liberated, well, you have to first expel and defeat that enemy, and then the people are liberated. So you could kind of take it in two ways at the same time. So Psalm 68 in Hebrew is about the conquest of the powers and the humiliation of the powers by Christ. And then Psalm 68 in the Greek, which is 67:7 and following, that's about the liberation of the man. And so it is about both conquest and liberation. It's a both and kind of issue. But that's more or less summarizing this kind of extended discussion I go into. We'll pick up down here with verse 3. We'll just move down to verse 3. So he lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart and broke the shackles in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Boring here highlights the invasion of God's holiness among the unclean. I like that idea of invasion. So he writes, a man immediately comes to meet him who is triply unclean. So he's possessed by unclean spirits, is living in unclean tombs, in a land populated by hordes of unclean, pigs and demons. And so, like the leprous man associated with demons, the man here is a picture of death, of one already banished from the land of the living, from human community that makes human life possible. Like the other exorcisms and healing stories, this story has overtones of the resurrection story, a prolepsis of what God did for humanity in the resurrection of Jesus. This is not a story about the response of faith and its transforming power, but about the invasion of alien territory and reclaiming it for the kingdom of God. I really like the way that that's put, because that goes very well into both what we have talked about just before this and what we're going to be talking about further down. Because remember, this is the first venture into Gentile territory. So very interesting. So man observes the burst of unique vocabulary as well as evidence of first-person recollection. I'm not going to get into this, but I do note it here because we'll eventually get into some of this kind of stuff as far as Mark's vocabulary and things like that. And so this is just an example that Mark sometimes does this, where he throws a number of words that he doesn't usually use. It's something that does happen. We'll hit down further. Williams is commenting on the Greek, kind of the oddity of it, that no one was able to bind him, not any longer, not even with a chain. It's kind of difficult to translate that part. It's kind of what it's getting at. But also connecting the episode to Isaiah 65, Gillick adds, taken together, these 3 verses contain the 4 characteristics of insanity in Judaism. A, running about at night. B, spending the night in a cemetery. C, tearing one's garments. And D, destroying what one has been given. And so this man is basically completely out of his mind in Jewish reckoning. Now here, I kind of want to do a sidebar back to the Divine Warrior, but specifically something I haven't picked up on in Mark, in the series of Mark. Again, if you've watched the Divine Warrior playlist or videos, you'll be familiar with this, but I put this here in case you haven't. So this is just a speed run of it. The people's inability to bind the demoniac underscores the need for the stronger man foretold by John the Baptist back in chapter 1. This emphasis on the vocabulary of binding, shackling, and chaining also evokes a central motif in typical ancient Near Eastern chaos conf narratives. Dempsey summarizes Forsyth's outline of the fundamental narrative elements of the Divine Warrior's battle with chaos. And so he identified these kind of 12 elements to the story, kind of like a hero's journey motif. Now, we don't get the full story. I've said this before. We don't really get the full story in the Old Testament. We mostly get kind of maybe the beginning, chaos, the emergence of chaos, and then we have the conclusion where Yahweh subdues that chaos. But we don't have these middle elements where Yahweh is consulting with other deities, is getting help, he's failing and then coming back. We don't have that kind of stuff. And I think that that's significant. But what we want to focus on here is really the end of it, the end of this conflict. So Dempsey later elaborates on some motifs of the story. So Dempsey writes, the most important of these include the following. 1. Because the hero is god of the storm, anthropomorphized meteorological phenomena provide common images. Thus, the winds are his chariot, lightning bolts are his arrows, and most importantly, thunder is his battle cry or mighty voice. At the sound of his mighty voice, the storm god's enemies quake, flee, or submit. Now remember, I talked about this at the end of last chapter, where Jesus calms the storm. He does so by what? By his voice, by speaking to it. And the disciples say, who is this that the wind and the sea literally listen to him? Again, they're listening to the voice, because that is the primary weapon of the Divine Warrior. Down to not verse 2, but point number 2, motif number 2, if you will. Whether in the context of battle or punishment, binding of the enemy is a recurrent topos, either with a rope or more specifically a muzzle. Again, what did we see Jesus do to the demon in chapter 1, as well as to the sea at the end of last chapter? He muzzled it. In English, it says things like he said, be silent or whatever, or peace, be still. But literally, it's be muzzled, be bound in a muzzle. And so, again, that is exactly what happens in the Divine Warrior stories. 3, after defeating the chaos monster, trampling of the body, or any form of stepping, stomping, standing upon the body are common punishments, thus humiliating the victim and exalting the victor. Isn't that interesting? Because Jesus speaks to the sea, rebukes it, and it listens to him. He says, be muzzled, right? But in chapter 6, Jesus is then going to walk on it. He's going to do this part of the victory part of the motif is going to walk on it, stand on its neck, right? So in the 4th one, so too is dividing, dismembering the body, which is usually followed by scattering of the corpse. Though distinct actions, the latter requires the former to have first taken place. And so I consider these 2 parts of the same motif. This is going to come up in a very interesting way later. In fact, I think it's chapter 6. So we'll hit that further down, but it's worth revisiting that this is part of the story, being bound, and the fact that this demon himself, or not the demon, but the man possessed with the demons, is himself bound. It's signaling us to this language, right? These motifs should be in our mind. So down to verse 5, night and day among the tombs on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. We have seen that Mark appears to evoke Psalm 68, a psalm highlighting the conflict between two mountains, Sinai and Bashan. It's worth noting now part of the DDD entry on Bashan. And so what it's getting at here, I'm not going to read it all out, but we basically have the same word, Bashan 1 and 2, that was proposed by Albright, where he's noticing that Bashan means serpent. And so he took it as a nickname for the Canaanite god Yamu. Of course, Yam is the Hebrew term for sea. The chaotic serpentine monster, given its apparent parallelism with Yam in Psalm 68:23. So here's the point. While it may not necessarily be etymologically linked, the point is when a Hebrew were to hear the word Bashan, yes, it's a geographical location that may have its own etymology, but they also would have heard the word for serpent or even dragon, okay? And so that is the location that Psalm 68 is talking about. It's the invasion of Bashan is what's going on in Psalm 68. And so, and this, a lot of this stuff, or some of this stuff, is connected to what I passed over earlier. But again, we're just being hit with so many motifs of the same thing happening over and over, just tightly, densely packed into a couple of these verses. And it's all going back to the same thing, God's conflict with chaos and his overcoming chaos. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing here with this man. Bashan was portrayed as being invaded by Yahweh, the divine warrior. Yet another psalm may also be in view. Dempsey draws our attention to another chaos conf motif. Dempsey writes, Mark's specification of his location on the mountains likely serves his narrative as more than just superfluous detail. As we have seen, of course, is referring to earlier in the book, one form of the Hebrew chaos conf seems to have echoed elements of the Mesopotamian myth of Ninurta and the Azak demon, where the chief concern after the chaos monster's defeat was the water's accumulation on the mountaintops. This is kind of interesting because if you think about the flood story in Genesis 6 and following, of course, the water goes up to the mountains. And of course, the flood is told very much in line with a creation story. And so that the waters go up to the mountaintops is kind of interesting because it does, eventually the waters recede. And so it does kind of connect a little bit to these themes as well. But anyway, back to Dempsey. Because of this, Ninurta created an irrigation system and thereby set the proper boundaries for the waters. Likewise, in the traditional Hebrew version, Yahweh subdues the rebellious waters on the mountains with his mighty rebuke, frightening them to flee to their proper boundaries. So that's how, in the Hebrew Bible, that's how the waters find their resting spot. Their proper location is not on the mountains. They've been rebuked by Yahweh to their proper dwelling in the sea, in the ocean. And so as I write, note the aforementioned anthropomorphized meteorological phenomena, as Dempsey put it. Psalm 104, he lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers winds, his ministers a flaming fire. Of special interest are the following verses in Greek. So verses 6 and 7, the deep, like a garment, is his covering. Over the mountains, waters will be established. From your censure, literally rebuke. This epitomeo language that Jesus does. Jesus rebukes these demons, right? It's the same language. From the rebuke, they will flee. From the voice of your thunder, they will be afraid. So I think that this is also connected. The waters are being rebuked from the mountains to the sea. What is happening here? They're on a mountain and Jesus is rebuking the demons. Eventually, they're going to go into the sea, right? So it's so neatly connected. Down to verse 6, and when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. The vocabulary of fell down before him ranges in meaning anywhere from a show of respect to outright worship. And this is the point that man makes. Now, before the resurrection, the disciples, still unable to grasp Jesus' true identity, likely interpreted this prostration as a gesture of profound respect. In Boring writes, page 150, in this encounter, the kingdom of God confronts the kingdom of evil. As elsewhere, the demons recognize Jesus' true identity. The answer to the disciples' question in 441 is given. Of course, that was the question of who then is this that even the sea and the wind obey him. But only the readers hear it, and it has no effect on the characters in the narrative. And so he's also kind of hitting on this this kind of part of the messianic secret, but it's kind of like messianic ignorance, if you will, where the people in the narrative are constantly missing it, especially the disciples. It's just kind of flying over their head. And so that this man possessed by demons falls down before him. And again, it could be taken either way. Is it just him showing respect, or is he actually worshiping Jesus? We'll loop back to that here in a moment. A reader aware of the full story can hardly avoid wondering whether this act of falling down before him ultimately alludes to Jesus' identity as the divine warrior and God of gods. Again, I'm going to loop back to this point, verses 7 and 8. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." The vocabulary of crying out is used 12 times in Mark. In all instances, it is Jesus who provokes them. Now, Michael Bird, in Reading Mark in Context, page 80, explains here, I'm just going to hit the conclusion, that the naming of Jesus as Son of the Most High is something of a plea of no contest. The demonic legion acknowledges Jesus' identity with an honorific title, not to gain power over Jesus by naming him, but to try desperately to convince him that his recognizable superiority renders any possible confrontation pointless. I think that's important because we've talked about this before. In fact, I write it here. As Gillick previously observed in his commentary on Mark 1, the demon's recognition of Jesus' identity is not apotropaic, but rather an acknowledgement of Jesus' superiority. So, of course, an apotropaic is kind of like a defense mechanism. Think like an amulet to ward off a demon would be considered an apotropaic. So the naming of the person you're kind of in this conflict with, of course, if you do that to a demon, the belief was you had power over it. And so a lot of commentators assume because the demon names Jesus, it's the demon trying to have superiority over him. But what Gillick had noted in Mark 1, citing another commentator, was the fact that it never functions that way. It's always a sign of recognition of your superior, kind of like the God over you. And so if the demon is naming Jesus, it's that, as Bird put it, it's basically him saying, I understand that you're superior over me, so we don't need this kind of conflict. In fact, it's kind of interesting because think about in Acts, I think it's chapter 19, but it's that episode where you have the sons of the high priest who are trying to cast out demons in Jesus' name. They say something like, in the name of Jesus, who Paul preaches, or something like that. And the demon turns to him, or the demons, and they say something to the effect of, I know Jesus, I know of Paul, but who are you, right? That right there is actually very consonant with this idea that to know the identity is to note their superiority in this context. If you're on the receiving end of it, to know the other person is, again, it's a sign of respect. To not know who they are, it's like, who is this? Who are you? I don't know who you are. And so that actually tracks with what you see elsewhere in the New Testament. But anyway, back to this. But the part I wanted to get to here in this quote from Gillick is this part down here about the Most High. So he says that the specific name, this title, the Most High God, has particular relevance for this Gentile setting, because remember, this is the journey into Gentile territory, since it almost always occurs in the LXX, on the lips, or in the context of Gentiles. And apart from here in a comparable setting in Acts 16-17, only appears in the New Testament as a reference from an Old Testament passage. Now, here's what I want to get into here, very briefly, is this title, Son of the Most High. As they're saying, it's not super common, but it's more of a Gentile thing. Now, why would it be more of a Gentile thing? It's very interesting because two of the places that you're going to have this kind of language pop up is in Psalm 82, specifically verse 6. I said, you are God's sons of the Most High. And so you have these supernatural entities that were supposed to shepherd humanity. We get the flip side of this in Deuteronomy 32:8, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, Tower of Babel, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So lesser territorial spirits were supposed to shepherd humanity. Things go off the rails, and that's really what's going on throughout a lot of the Old Testament. This is, Michael Heiser stuff, divine counsel, whatever. Pretty well tread territory for many people. For other people, it's kind of new, but I mean, hey, it's there. This is the explanation for where the gods of the other nations come from. It's a little simplistic to just say gods of the other nations are demons. It's like, demon is a broad enough term to actually to do that. I understand that things are more nuanced than that, but for our purposes here, we're observing that this title seems to be mostly connected with this idea that Israel is the Lord's portion, as it says here, and the other nations are put under the dominion, if you will, of the sons of God, right? These, again, territorial spirits. Of course, Deuteronomy 32:17 is where we get by the way, it mentions bashan up here, right here. We have this explicit identification, although I'm not crazy about what the ESV does here. They sacrificed to demons that were not Eloah. Eloah is always singular. It should say they sacrificed to demons, not God, not the true God, to gods they had never known. So here it's making that connection that you have these other spirits, they're over these geographical locations, and this most high language is the recognition of that. And how Psalm 82 actually connects to this is interesting, because they lead humanity astray, as I write here in Psalm 82, 81 in the Greek. We learn of their future ultimate fate, destruction. The fate, or a fate, that is cryptically connected to the resurrection. So we get this elsewhere in the New Testament. Paul links the crucifixion with the humiliation of the powers, Jesus' triumph, ideas like that, which we will hit later in Mark. But in Psalm 82, 8 in the Greek, stand up, O God, judge the earth, because you will inherit among all the nations. Of course, remember, this is the language that we got over here about inheritance. So once upon a time, God gives dominion, gives rulership over to lesser creatures to shepherd the Gentile nations. They do a poor job of this. But this is why there are these gods in these other nations. Now, what's happening here is God is coming back to reclaim, to retake the nations for himself. How is he going to do that? How is he going to judge and inherit the nations? Stand up, oh God. Right? That's kind of a little subtle hint, because anestemy is New Testament resurrection language. We will see the unclean spirits' fear of their fate in verse 10. However, Mark 5:6 may be a fulfillment of the Greek of Deuteronomy 32:43. Now, of course, verse 6 was when he saw Jesus, of course, he fell down before him. And we pointed out that language is subtle enough, or it's nuanced enough, that it could just be homage you pay to somebody else, but it could carry all the way up to worship. Later down in Deuteronomy 32, which is the passage connected to the Most High, all of this stuff, we have this: delight, O heavens, with him, and worship him, you sons of God. As you can see, hopefully, it's the same language. And so I think that this could be a subtle nod to that, in the already but not yet kind of sense. That the demons, of course, this isn't known in the moment. Like I said before, this is like flying over their head. They just see a man, bow down, or, whatever, just showing Jesus respect. But I think underneath it is this. It's already the beginning of them being stripped of their dominion and power in their possession. It's people. The people are being possessed by these demons. And Jesus is here to reclaim, to retake back these nations. Now, down to verse 8, I have another little sidebar here. I'll try to do this quickly. But verse 8 is when Jesus is saying, for he was saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. So commentary on verse 8 is extensive. Verse 8 could plausibly be read before verse 7, and probably it can be, and probably should be, like it is before verse 7, leaving some to argue that verse 8 was a failed first attempt to exorcise the demon. And so this is funny to me, because like I kind of joked with somebody before about this, that the TikTok Mormon guy, that I swear I could predict where he's going to land on almost any issue. And it's not because it's data driven, it's because it's like, which view is the most damaging to a conservative Christianity, a conservative view of the Bible? And he's going to take the view that hurts it the most. And this is, I've never heard him talk about this, but I could almost guarantee he would go in this direction, where he would just look you in the camera and just authoritatively just say things like, in Mark 5 verses 7 and 8, we have here Jesus this is kind of how his argument would go. We see Jesus not as true God because we see him fail to exorcise a demon. Jesus needs to learn the name of this demon. We see the demon fight back by naming him. Again, he would go in the apotropaic way of looking at this, that the demon is fighting back here. And so Jesus is failing because you have that line, for he was saying to him. In other words, Jesus said, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And then we have crying out with a loud voice, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? So they're saying, oh, see, he's fighting back. And that's why Jesus first says, come out of the man. And it's not working because the demon's fighting back. That's the way some people take it. Let me skip further down. Gillick is also going to comment. Without doubt, the comment stands in awkward tension with what has gone before by implying a previous ineffectual command for the unclean spirit to come out of him. This is interesting because, again, he's right that this would seem to be at odds. That this interpretation, that this is a failed attempt, it's like the spirit has been showing complete submission. So why would it change here? So that would kind of be odd. But he says this implication stands at odds, however, with the story's repeated emphasis on the servile position of the unclean spirit towards Jesus. And so another commentator argued that basically the redactor here misunderstood kind of what was going on. Not crazy about that interpretation. If, however, we take this explanatory comment specifically with the adjuration of 7b, it explains why the unclean spirit feared torture and what the torture was. The unclean spirit had been ordered out of its present habitat. This explanation also sets the stage for the dialogue in verses 9 and 10 and verse 12, which develops both the concern for the torture by expulsion and sets up the actual banishment of verse 13 in keeping with the demon's request in verses 10 and 12. Let me try to summarize this, but first, let me just kind of, by way of analogy, if I was telling you about somebody being robbed, like at gunpoint or something, and I said that the person fought back, you would probably imagine it, like I'm thinking of an MMA fighter, a female fighter that was actually this guy tried to rob her, and she, like, the mugshot's funny because the guy's just like completely beat up. And so you would probably picture that. What you would not picture as fighting back is falling down on the floor saying, please don't hurt me, right? That's not fighting back. And so when Jesus says to the man or to the spirits, come out of him, and the demons fall down and beg him not to be tortured, I don't see that as fighting back. That it just doesn't work. So unless the scholars could point me to that as that would somehow constitute a failed exorcism, is the demons begging not to be sent away, I see that as kind of like almost like a bartering. Again, if somebody robbed you and said, give me your wallet and your possessions, and you fall down, you're not fighting back. You're just in such submission to the point that you're not doing anything, right? You're in the pleading stage. And so, like I said, unless somebody could show me that would be considered a failed exorcism, again, especially in light of the other stuff, the naming Jesus, Son of the Most High, is not the demon fighting back. It's a recognition of his superior. That, again, I just don't think that this works. But in spite of all that, even if one were to interpret verse 8 as a failed attempt, an interesting interpretive possibility, typo there, emerges as Dempsey writes. Now, I'm not going to read out all of this for the sake of time, but this goes back to those 12 elements I showed of the divine warrior motif. And remember, we skipped over those middle sections because I said this doesn't really happen in the Hebrew Bible, where you have the divine warrior failing, you have him consulting other gods and stuff like that. That just doesn't happen. But what Dempsey is pointing out is, if this were the case, if this needed a second attempt, if you will, that would actually follow the theme of the divine warrior in the broader ancient Near Eastern context. And so, therefore, if this was a failure, we could see it through this lens, which would mean what? Again, this is Jesus as the divine warrior. This is not him. This isn't Jesus actually being God, because here he can't overpower this demon. No. If even if that's the direction you want to go with some of these critical scholars, even so, you have an argument that could go with that in saying, yes, it was a failure, but that was merely part of the rhetorical device that Mark is using to portray Jesus as the divine warrior. So even if you try to downplay Jesus' divinity here, it kind of backfires, I think, on you. Now, here Dempsey actually gets into another aspect of this, which is that the demons then go into the pigs and then rush into the sea, drowning themselves. And it doesn't seem like the demons really thought that that was going to happen. And so some of the commentaries pick up on this trickery of the demons by Jesus. And so Dempsey is saying trickery, as we have seen earlier in his book, was often the means to victory by the divine warriors of ancient Near Eastern combat myths. And here he lists examples in which this kind of thing happens, so it could be that. In summary, even if Jesus' first attempt was unsuccessful, it could be the author's way of tying Jesus to divine warrior chaos conf motifs. Now down to verse 9, and Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Commentaries note the possible anti-Rome overtones of Legion. Boring is illustrative. So he writes, the 10th Legion, stationed in Palestine, had the insignia of a wild boar on its banners. In the latter part of the Jewish revolt against Rome, Vespasian sent troops under the command of Lucius Annaeus on a punitive raid to Gergesa, burned the city, and devastated the surrounding villages. If Mark was written shortly after 70 AD, this would have been a recent event. It has often been noted that the word for herd is not really appropriate for pigs, but was used for military units, and permitted them in verse 13 could be translated as dismissed them with a military overtone, just as rushed could be translated charged with military connotation. The demon's plea not to be sent out of the country can be seen as a transparent to the unwillingness of the Roman occupation force to leave Palestine. Yet Horace, devoted supporter of Rome 2 generations before, had spoken of a cohort of fever demons, and Mark's explicit interpretation of Legion is not directly anti-Roman, but refers only to the vast number of demons inhabiting the poor man. Thus, for Mark, the meaning of the story cannot be reduced to an allegory of liberation from the Romans. Its horizon is broader than that, within a cosmic and eschatological framework, but it could hardly have been read in Mark's time without political overtones. So as I conclude here, I agree Mark wasn't writing a political polemic. However, the observations about military language may be important to Mark's portrayal. Remember, the Hebrew Bible finds its archetypal episode of the divine warrior in Exodus 15, where we see Yahweh, the man of war, defeat an army horde or legion in the sea. Watts ties the motifs together. So he writes, furthermore, the stress which Mark places on the strength of the demoniac, and particularly the pericope's military terminology, not only highlights the conflict motif, but in view of its being linked with the storm stilling in chapter 4, also provides important hermeneutical points of reference as to the significance of the double event of storm stilling and exorcism drowning. In the first instance, the statement in verse 4, and no one had the strength to subdue him, appears to echo the terminology of the strong man in Mark 3, and also perhaps that of John's description of Jesus, the stronger man in 1:7. In the second, Derrett, noting the strange behavior of the pigs, has observed the presence of military overtones in Mark's terminology. Again, we just looked at all of this stuff. Legion, sending, dispatching. Clearly inappropriate for pigs indicates a band of military recruits, and they rushed describes troops rushing into battle. Given the military connotations and the memory of the first Exodus, where Israel witnessed the drowning of a large hostile force, Derrett suggests that the drowning of the demonized legion of idolatrous pigs is intended to recall the defeat of the Pharaoh god during Israel's deliverance from bondage. Isn't that interesting too, the way he puts it, Pharaoh/God, because Exodus 12:12, tonight, I will have victory over the gods of Egypt. Again, that's back to the Deuteronomy 32 kind of stuff. And so we're seeing it here, the legion of demons being drowned. It's connecting back to this Exodus motif, as well as, again, Passover, crossing of the Red Sea. All of these themes are starting to stack. Furthermore, the drowning of Pharaoh's hosts in Israel's founding moment is appealed to on several occasions in Isaiah 40 through 55, where it not only provides evidence of the Yahweh warrior's ability to execute the new Exodus. He caused them to lay down the sea, never to rise again. That's 43:16 of Isaiah, but also establishes the basis of the supplication for a similar intervention. Consequently, the strange conjunction of the Old Testament images of anti-idol polemic, an oppressive demonic military host, and the drowning in the sea is entirely consonant with a portrayal of Jesus as Israel's Isaianic new Exodus deliverer. In other words, as I've been saying, divine warrior. I would suggest that for Mark, the pericope of the Gerasene demoniac shows Jesus to be the Isaianic new Exodus Yahweh warrior who defeats the hostile powers, now in their New Testament demonic manifestation as legion, by drowning them in the sea, just as in the first Exodus. Amen. Well put. I think that ties all of these themes together of what I'm trying to get at. And maybe haven't been making super clear, but hopefully I have. But we saw in the first 3 verses in the prologue, all of those verses have to do with this stuff. The Exodus, the celebration of the Exodus through the Feast of Tabernacles, and the new Exodus motif. The future hope, the future eschatological hope of this new Exodus, where God is going to come back and set things right. And the answer is he has done that. He's done it now. He's doing it through Jesus in these acts that mirror the divine warrior of the Old Testament. But I like what Dempsey says of this. He says, as the puppet master of oppressive nations, Satan's power is the true source of Rome's power, and thus Satan, not Rome, is the ultimate enemy. Rome is a helper beast. Satan is the dragon. And then down to verse 10, and he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. And note the switching between kind of singulars and plurals there. Now, this issue is actually kind of interesting, especially in light of everything we've just talked about. Divine warrior stuff, divine council things, Deuteronomy 32 stuff, because what we have here in verse 10, that they beg him earnestly not to send them out of the country. And so they're referring to this language here. And so man writes of this, the belief was common in the ancient world that demons were associated with a particular place. And he cites here Luke 11:24, which itself is kind of interesting because if we were to look at this, I need to study this passage. I've not done that. But what's interesting is he could have cited a number of passages, obviously all the Deuteronomy 32 kind of stuff. But what's interesting to me is the previous chapter, Luke 10. It begins with Jesus appointing 72, right? So he has 12 disciples, but here he sends out 72, 2 by 2, going out to all the towns. And when they return in verse 17, the 72 or 70, depending on the manuscript tradition, they returned with joy saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. So what's clearly happening here is it's mirroring Deuteronomy 32, where at the Tower of Babel, there were 70 or 72 nations, depending on how you do the math, how you count that. So that's why you have 2 different manuscript traditions in the New Testament about whether Jesus sent 70 or 72 disciples out to preach 2 by 2. But what he's doing is he's mirroring the fact that they're going out into these locations that are where the demons are, again, geographically over these certain locations. And so man, even without going into that direction, it just, he's tracking on this because of course he is. Any commentary that is being sensitive to what's happening in the text is going to note these kinds of things, even if they don't bring all the divine counsel stuff out with it. It's completely consistent with this because this is a valid observation that's being made. So continuing back with man, he says, this fact does not, however, remove the difficulty inherent in Luke's reading of into the abyss. So instead of saying that they beg not to be sent out of the country, it says sent into the abyss, right? So he says the abyss was the place of final punishment for demons, and this seems, on all accounts, to be the original meaning. I'm guessing he means here like original version, like Q or something, like Jesus originally said that. I could not find this article by Shorts. in this recent article, blah, 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 convincingly argues the difference between country in Mark and abyss in Luke goes back to a confusion in Aramaic between Tehuma, district, place, and Tehoma, the deep, in Luke 8:31, representing the original reading. And so as I conclude down here, harmonizing Luke 8:31, it's possible country and abyss were mentioned. They begged him not to send them out of the country, Tehuma, into the abyss, Tehoma. So he could have actually stated both, and each is drawing something different. Now, here's what I find kind of funny. In fact, I didn't know that I went into this in my notes, into what I just talked about with, the 70 or 72 back in Deuteronomy 32. But one thing worth noting here, Luke elsewhere seems to be sensitive to the Deuteronomy 32 kind of stuff, divine counsel kind of themes, and he seems to track on that quite a bit. Whereas, as I've been saying, Mark is more tracking on divine warrior motifs. And what's interesting is this right here seems to fit more. Send out of the country seems to fit more directly to divine counsel, the idea of Deuteronomy 32, spirits over geographical regions, whereas this seems to fit more with the divine warrior thing. They don't want to be sent back into the waters of chaos. And it's like the two authors normally track on certain themes, and it seems like here they've kind of swapped, where Mark's reading of country seems to go more with that Deuteronomy 32 concept, because Luke, so we have down here in verse 6, this is Pentecost, right? So the coming of the Spirit at the sound of the multitude came together, and they were bewildered because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. Here's what's interesting. If we were to go Genesis 11, Tower of Babel, we have down here, the Lord had confounded the language. So at the Tower of Babel, of course, the people began to speak different languages. Of course, if you were to actually look at the narrative and the biographical kind of stuff, it seems to be a process that happens over time. But no longer do the people understand each other's language. And there's confusion there. There's bewilderment there that they can no longer understand each other. Here, at Pentecost, the Spirit descends on them. And they begin to hear. They're bewildered. Why? Verse 7 tells us why. They were amazed and astonished because they were saying, are not all of these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native languages? So they're like, these people are not trained in these other languages. Why am I hearing the gospel in my language? And so they're confused. They're confounded. And so it's the grand reversal of God's decision at Babel to divide the nations. And here, in a sense, the nations have come back together to gather at Pentecost. And here, the Spirit descends. They're empowered with the supernatural ability now to speak languages they don't know, or to hear languages, hear somebody's speech and hear the gospel in their own language. That's really what tongues is about. It's the speaking of known languages, but it's like they didn't have they didn't have Duolingo and they didn't have Google Translate. So it's like God had to supernaturally empower them to be able to understand this stuff. And that's basically what's going on now. Luke tracks through these kinds of concepts. So it is kind of interesting that it seems like they swap here at this moment where the demons are begging not to be sent out of the country. And of course, they're tricked into being sent out of the country via the pigs. And this is what I'm getting into. Again, Deuteronomy 32. Also, verse 17 makes the direct identification that the gods of the nations are demons. And Edwards has this note, which is kind of interesting, about the presence of the pigs. He says, in the region, there were also swine herders, following the Old Testament prescription against swine, so on and so forth. Although the staple food of the Roman army was grain and corn, meat was a prized supplement when available. If the swineherds were supplying the Roman legions with pork, then the raising of unclean food for the detested Roman occupation was doubly offensive. Thus, Jesus meets a man with an unclean spirit living among unclean tombs, surrounded by people employed in unclean occupations, all in unclean Gentile territory. So if the pigs were being used for the food, they were supplying the Roman legion with this food. So it's like insult to injury kind of a thing. Down to verse 12, and they begged him, saying, send us to the pigs, let us enter them. Now, France is going to note here the transfer from man to animal. Like this actually does have analog elsewhere. So he says the possibility of an alternative refuge in animals rather than in a man was apparently not a new one. A Babylonian exorcist incantation offers a pig as an alternative host for the expelled demon. The ritual uncleanness of pigs from a Jewish point of view would add further point to the transfer. From a man living among unclean tombs, the unclean spirits transfer to unclean animals. But moving on, although I do like that last sentence, there is no question that he will send them away. The only issue is where. Of course, he sends them into the pigs, which they themselves send themselves out of the region. Gillick also notes the possibility of trickery of the demons. Such a banishment of the demons into the other areas or objects has its parallel in ancient literature, but such action never comes as a concession to the demons. Consequently, some have read this request as the stage setting for the main point of the original Trick the Devil story in light of the consequence of their request. So again, the demons may not have seen what was coming. Down to verse 13, so he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. Dempsey here provides a conclusion to the narrative, and he's also going to pick up on some of the themes that we've looked at. So the demons, which used to cry out on the tops of the mountains, are now, after the divine victory, sent down the steep bank into the sea, the place which the Lord Jesus has assigned. Perkins insightfully notes, with allusion to the preceding event in Mark's Gospel, the storm at sea has evoked the mythic cosmology of the divine warrior's victory over the chaos monster. Although the demons try to avoid being driven out of the country, they wind up in the sea, the waters of chaos where they belong. Here, as in the Exodus story, the divine warrior is not defeating the sea itself, but rather employing it as a tool for his defeat of an enemy. Again, Mark's Exodus typology becomes fully appreciable only in the context of the combat myth and divine warfare. Down to verses 14 and 15, the herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. The fear of the people calls back to Mark 4:41, and this is the disciples. And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" This callback strongly binds the sea calming narrative and this exorcism. I think that's really important. The two are interpreting each other. And without spoiling anything, this is going to happen again, where we're going to have kind of a callback. And I would argue that both narratives are intimately tied to divine warrior stuff. So it's really interesting the way that Mark is signaling, hey, if you're missing the point, here's the point. And sadly, we're often missing the point here. So down to verses 16 and 17, and those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from the region. Ironically, the story pivots on two nearly identical pleas. First from the demons, then from the people. The demons beg Jesus not to send them out of the region, and he grants their request, though they are ultimately removed by trickery. But once the townspeople witness the aftermath, evil cast out, the possessed man restored, they too begin to beg. Only this time the plea is for Jesus himself to leave. The one who delivered their neighbor from torment becomes to them a greater disturbance than the demons were. In the end, it's not just the unclean spirits, but the Savior who is driven out. And that is a very sad conclusion in one sense to the story. Now, there is something of a happy ending, if you will. So down to verse 18, and he was getting into the boat, that is Jesus, and the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. So notice, again, this repeated language of begging all throughout. The commentaries discuss the potentially technical language of this verse. So Gillick writes that he may be with him has two functions. First, this request offers a stark contrast to that of the inhabitants in verse 17. Remember, they begged Jesus to leave. The one rejected Jesus out of fear. The other wanted to share his company. Second, the wording of this request corresponds to one of Jesus' purposes for calling the 12 in Mark 3:14, namely to be with him. It would seem that level of intimacy, this is me writing, was reserved for his chosen 12. France writes of the conclusion of this narrative. The choice of the 12 has already been made, and the addition of a Gentile member to Jesus' inner circle would have been a radical departure, for which there is no parallel during Jesus' ministry. But neither of these considerations is mentioned either. The reason for refusal is rather the positive one that this man has an opportunity, which is uniquely his, to spread the news of what God is doing through Jesus of Nazareth among those who have known what he was before, and who therefore cannot ignore the dramatic change which has resulted from his encounter with Jesus. In emphasizing this motivation, Mark no doubt expects his readers to understand that the same principle applies to others whose lives Jesus has changed, even in less dramatic circumstances. And so this man has a unique opportunity to be, in many ways, the first disciple, or the first apostle, if you will, to the Gentile region. And so down to verse 19, and he did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. It is atypical that Jesus does not vow the man to secrecy. He rather encourages the proclamation. And so France writes of this, the contrast with Jesus' command to silence in 144 and also 543, 736, 826 is striking and prompts the question why Jesus is so keen to avoid publicity among the Jews, but he has no objection to Gentiles hearing about his miracles. This is, of course, part of the whole enigma of the theme of secrecy in Mark. But it is true that publicity among the Jews posed the risk not only of inconvenient popular enthusiasm, but also of a misguided popular assessment of his messianic role. In Gentile territory, that risk did not exist, since it was far from the scene of Jesus' regular ministry, and there was no ready-made messianic expectation to contend with. Now, it's worth noting, though, that among the passages that France mentioned was in chapter 8, where that is also in Gentile territory, and he does vow that man to secrecy, although he doesn't do it like many of these people. But so it can't just purely be a Jew-Gentile thing. What's probably also lurking beneath this is the fact that Jesus is driven from the region. He's not allowed to continue. The people don't want him there. And it could have had to do something with the economic loss of losing the animals. People speculate that maybe that kind of disturbance was partially behind it. But either way, Jesus is not going to be there. Now he needs somebody there in his stead, right? He's not going to be there to preach. So the good news needs to go out there. So he allows this man to do that. Now, concluding with France, since this was not an area where Jesus himself would be preaching, there he goes, it is appropriate that the news of God's new initiative in Jesus should be announced there by one of the local people who has himself experienced its power. Now, as I conclude, the shift from Jesus' instruction, what the Lord has done, to the man's proclamation, what Jesus has done, invites reflection. Gillick writes of this conclusion, announced to them has a parallel in early Christian mission terminology. Furthermore, the content of his announcement, how much the Lord has done and how merciful he has been, reinforces this apparently technical usage. But this hardly provides sufficient basis for making this man the first missionary to the Gentiles and his task a product of the early Christian mission. Gillick, however, doesn't explain why it isn't sufficient. I don't understand why he says that. I suppose he could be, I didn't read this from Pesh, so I don't know. Perhaps he was making the argument that this is like a later redactional thing. And so, again, it's this invented story about early Christian missionaries, so they put that in there or whatever. I don't know. But either way, it's like, but the guy is really, technically speaking, the first missionary in that region. Either way, France notes of this, but whereas Jesus has told him to declare what God has done for him, he attributes the agency to Jesus himself. He actually says Kyrios, right? So Lord. France here says Kyrios equals God, right? So he's saying Jesus said everything God has done for him. And Luke has the same discrepancy, even more marked, since he used theos. So he actually uses the term God, that is Luke does, rather than kyrios, which means Lord in Jesus' instruction. Now, if you don't know, kyrios is the divine name, Yahweh in the Greek, right? That's what they use to translate the divine name. But it's also just the generic term for Lord. And so it's context dependent. It could be a reference to Yahweh. It could just be a reference to Lord in a generic sense. So what's intended here, who knows? You have to debate that. Back to France. In the narrative context, this need betray no more than the man's rudimentary theological understanding, but Mark's readers might be expected to notice and appreciate the implied identification of the work of God with the work of Jesus. The man's proclamation produces amazement, but we are not told whether it had more lasting effect. The next time Jesus appears in the Decapolis, however, he will be expected to heal, and the result will be further proclamation and further astonishment. Already the foundation has been laid for the extension to the Gentiles of the ministry and mission of the Jewish Messiah. Now, as I conclude down here, just as the demon's act of prostration before Jesus carries an ambiguity, was it an act of deference or worship? So too, the healed man's understanding of kyrios, that is Lord, may reveal narrative irony. When Jesus tells him to declare what the Lord has done, the man proceeds to proclaim what Jesus has done, seemingly equating the two. Though he doesn't use the title himself, his identification of Jesus with kyrios may reflect a deeper truth the reader doesn't yet fully comprehend. Typical of Mark's pattern in which Jesus' identity is only fully grasped in light of the resurrection. And so that is going to be what we do today. Like I said, I'm not going to go into the rest of Mark just for the sake of time, but this was a very dense chapter, of course, because this is, I would say, the most on-the-nose, explosive, divine warrior activity going on. So I wanted to make sure we did some of that stuff, and there's even more in the notes here because I didn't get into absolutely everything, but that will suffice, I think, for today.